Moving into the sixth unit of this Credit Recovery American History, we're going to be finally finishing off Unit 4, where that was the start of the Cold War. This is going to be the end of the Cold War. So we're going to pick it up right around 1963-ish. I will backtrack a little bit just to kind of help give it a little bit more context, but this unit is going to go all the way through the end of the Cold War in 1989-ish, so again, a little bit after. But why does all this matter is that there is going to be one of the massive conflicts in our American history take place during this time, and it's going to be the Vietnam War. So I'm going to talk about why the Vietnam War started, talk about what was it like for the soldiers that were fighting there, and then you're going to notice that a huge shift in the United States public is going to happen during this lesson or this war. So as always, make sure you're watching for the causes and effects there at the bottom. But then also now we're going to go back to this question of which challenge was the greatest in the Cold War. So today we're going to be getting into the Vietnam War specifically. I'm going to be talking a lot about it. And even though this video is going to be no longer than 15 minutes, this whole war you could spend a month on if you really wanted to, just because all the ins and outs. So anyways, getting into why this matters. Again, about every life in the late 60s, mid 70s, I guess you would say, is going to be impacted by this war. Okay, me personally, my father was in Vietnam, so that's kind of why this is near and dear to my heart. So you'll also notice that this is going to cause a lot of division in our country. It's going to tear our country apart, supporting or being against the war. And then also this is going to be changing the way wars are going to be reported on, because it's going to be the first TV war. News cameras are actually going to be across the ocean reporting back to people in their homes in the United States. So people are going to be able to see the actual fighting. So how does this all start? I take you back to the mid to late 1800s. And it's important to establish that France was actually in control of what is now Vietnam during that time. You're going to notice that it's actually called Indochina, or French Indochina, if I remember right. And during this time, they are going to have a fairly good chunk of population. But just like everything else with imperialism, they wanted it mostly for the resources and taxes. People could pay for a lot of taxes there. So fast forward to the end of World War II, where you're going to notice that China is actually, or not China, excuse me, Japan is actually going to have parts of control. And you're going to notice that during this time, people of Vietnam are going to get sick of being oppressed, and they're going to be sick of being under other people's control. So this is going to come back to bite us in a little bit, because after World War II, our president Truman also says that no country should be in imperialistic control of another country. So we don't really want to make France upset, because they are our ally and they need post World War II help. So we actually support France. So we're kind of being a hypocrite here. So, especially in time of Cold War, we didn't want to piss off any friends. That's kind of why it went on for as long as it did. So this is grounds for communism needs to be in place, because when life is bad, it seems like a lot of countries are going to become communist in our history. So enter in Ho Chi Minh, lower right-hand corner, leader that's going to be United States educated. And when he goes back home, he is going to start planting the seed of communism. And he actually has a large following, and it's called the Viet Minh or the Viet Cong during this time. So again, our president after Truman was Eisenhower, and he just kind of kept the train rolling of what Truman established. He had bigger fears in this world than what was going on in Vietnam. So he practiced the whole containment foreign policy that we established in Unit 4. But this is where it starts getting interesting, is after Vietnam is now under direct threat of becoming communist, we had this thing called the domino theory start coming to effect. We were actually very worried that if Vietnam were to turn communist, all these other countries in Southeast Asia would eventually fall as well. And what we were primarily concerned with is one of our top allies, the Philippines, and Australia. So that was kind of our main motive with all this. But again, it's called domino theory because, pretty self-explanatory. If one goes down, they all go down. So this is where the French are actually going to lose control. And it all starts with this base up here called Dien Bien Phu. And this is where you're going to notice that when the French lose control of that area, the northern half of Vietnam actually turns communist pretty dang quick. And their leader is going to be Ho Chi Minh, the guy that I talked about earlier. We were able to keep capitalism and democracy in the South. So North and South Vietnam, very similar to Korea, are going to have different motives or different lifestyles. And you're going to notice that throughout the course of this lesson, they're going to start to conflict until it starts a war. But before we get any further, which term was used to describe the fear of multiple countries falling to communism? So again, where this all starts to get a little bit more interesting is in the later 50s. So again, you got to keep in mind the United States, we are rocking and rolling in our United States. Also, the Korean War is starting to wind down, I guess, at this point. So we had a lot of other things happening. But again, the Viet Cong are actually rising up to power underneath our nose, I guess you would say. We, again, were still helping out the gentleman in the South. And this is him. This is the leader of the South. His name is, I don't know how to pronounce his first part, but his last name is DM. So why this matters is because we supported him. And future President JFK is actually going to grow to not really like him a whole lot. But I'll talk about more when I get there. But the problem with mostly is that DM is going to be very unpopular right out of the gate. He actually openly opposed Buddhism, which is the national religion of Vietnam. So you can actually see a Buddhist monk protesting him down here in the lower right-hand corner. He actually sets himself on fire. Now, him, again, he is an whole interesting story in himself. Set himself on fire, went into deep meditation, didn't move a muscle until eventually his body just was a crisp. But interesting thing, his heart was completely intact once they went and looked at him. But why did DM not like Buddhism? Because he's Catholic. And that's why JFK is going to not do anything worse, because he took it upon himself to not hurt his fellow Catholic, I guess you would say. So, speaking of JFK, you're going to notice that he is actually going to continue on with what previous presidents did. Okay, so by sending troops to the area. And again, it was just as a policing thing at first. So, as in 1963. So, you're going to notice that we're going to send a good amount of troops there. And after he's assassinated, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who we talked about, is going to kind of practice the same thing. He doesn't really want to start a war with them, but he just doesn't want war to carry on. So, war actually comes and finds us, because in 1964, the official start of the Vietnam War is going to happen. The North is actually going to supposedly fire onto some of our boats, and it's going to be called the Gulf of Tonkin. So, again, why I say supposedly is because there wasn't really a whole lot of evidence that backed this up. But needless to say, when we're fired on, we fire back. So that's what's officially going to start the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin. So, with it all starting, that officially gives us the green light to start bombing. And you're going to see Operation Rolling Thunder is going to start. So, I know what you're asking yourself. You mean we had a plan in place before a war actually started? And we can't prove or disprove that. However, what we do know is the result. When we dropped all of these bombs on Vietnam, we absolutely destroyed a large section of their land. And that's kind of why all this matters. You see the stat here that we dropped 6 million tons, and that's 3 times as many of all, good or bad, side of World War II. But you're going to notice that the terrain didn't really change a whole lot. I'm going to talk about that more here in a little bit. But second question is, which event officially started the Vietnam War for the United States? So again, kind of building back to what I just talked about, normal bombs really didn't have a whole lot of effect in this terrain because it was humid, it was tropical, and it was too wet, I guess you would say. So enter in our response, Agent Orange. So this is kind of like Super Roundup if you've ever used that. You spray it on something green, it's going to eventually die. It's called a herbicide. So why this matters is that our U.S. soldiers are going to need paths cleared in these jungles, and this is what we're going to do. We're going to spray the living crap out of it. Now, the problem is that this is also a carcinogen, meaning this eventually causes birth defects and cancer on the soldiers themselves and then their future family. So that's kind of a bad thing. And actually, current soldiers that are still alive, that served in these areas are getting payment from the government as kind of an apology for doing all this. And to show you the effectiveness of this herbicide, plants in Vietnam are still not growing in some of these spots. So enter in another weapon, napalm. So imagine like Jello that's super sticky, but made with gasoline instead of water. You throw it against something, in this case, you would light it on fire and it would burn. But what we did is we basically just dropped it out of planes. So this is what's going to be used to clear off all these timbers or these forests, whatever you want to call them. So what else is happening is that when we get involved with Vietnam, you're going to notice that it's going to be pretty much new. Where before in World War II, we wanted to acquire what was lost, here we didn't really know how to fight. So the other problem with this is that with South Vietnam, we didn't know who the bad guys were and we didn't know who the good guys were. When you were to put a North Vietnam person and a South Vietnam side by side, you didn't know who was who. So this is going to basically be in favor of the people from the north, the New Viet Cong, if you will, because they can hide in plain sight. And when it came down to fighting, we were in their backyard. They knew where to go, where to hide, how to live off the land. So you're going to notice these jungles, these rice paddies, these mountains, they just had a heyday. And so guerrilla warfare was really their thing, storming out, shooting up, and then go back into hiding. So going back to what the soldier looked like, this is basically, yeah, somebody that had a handful of rice, somebody that traveled very light and used their terrain to their advantage. And they actually set a bunch of booby traps everywhere. And this is what's going to do a lot of the killing. Because if you look at these two examples here, not only if a US soldier were to step on all that, it would like jack up their foot, but sometimes they'd put some sort of like infectious material on the barbs. So like they would either pee on it or they poop on it and it causes a massive bacteria infection. And this is what would eventually cause some death as well. So these are just a few examples. If you go to YouTube and you type in Vietnam War booby traps, there is a really, really good video that kind of explains them all. But the main thing that the Viet Cong used was darkness. They would do a lot of their fighting at night. Again, they knew exactly where they were at all times. The US soldiers had no idea. So at night, it was a super scary time in the Vietnam. So what else did they do? They also had a very vast supply line. When rules of war, when you declare war or when you're fighting a war in the United States, you're only isolated to that country. What the Viet Cong were doing, they were using their neighbors of Laos and Cambodia to move supplies up and down the whole coast or the whole borderline of Vietnam. And it's actually called the Ho Chi Minh Trail because this is what kept their soldiers going. This is what kept their people going. And again, there's nothing we could absolutely do about it. So, a question for you. The U.S. soldiers in Vietnam faced what type of challenges? And then lastly, when the soldiers themselves start getting beaten down, that's where you're going to notice that this war is going to take a huge shift. So about a year into this war, about 2 years, I guess you would say, you're going to notice that that mind shift is going to change because of the uncertainty or the challenges that we've already talked about. And it's only going to cost more lives, more money. And with that, basically all the bad things that are going to be happening back home that I'm going to talk about in lesson 2 are actually now making their way into, I guess, the limelight or the attention of the soldiers. So they're not feeling appreciated at home. And to top it all off, a lot of these soldiers are actually there because they're being forced to because of the draft. So you can only imagine that this didn't really vote well. So where this is going to basically hit full steam and like, oh my gosh, this is going to be terrible, is that the volunteers, I guess you would say, or the people that are being drafted, you're going to notice that they're going to make up the majority of the people that served. So their heart just completely is not in it. And again, when you have that deflating morale from back home, like, they don't are appreciated, they don't really want to be there. So that's going to be another thing that's weighing on their minds. So last question for you. True or false? The U.S. soldier morale was high during the early Vietnam War.